Well, hey guys, and welcome to a new installment of Inner Sugar Modeler HFO. Now, I know it's been a while since I've done one of these segments, and it was never my intention to completely discontinue them from the channel, but it did get to be quite the challenge to try to coordinate time schedules, particularly when I was trying to interview modelers from other parts of the country, so everything just kind of fell by the wayside. But I've been wanting to get my friend Joe Hudson on the channel. Joe is a guy I've gotten to know over the last few years, and he is quite the accomplished figure and bust painter, and it's through his guidance I've been able to improve my own techniques immensely, and I continue to learn from him. Now, earlier this year, Joe was able to get a book published called Modeling Military Figures. It's put out through Fine Scale Modeler magazine, and it is a great guide for both beginners and experienced modelers. So in this interview, you'll get to know a little bit about Joe, how he got into the art form, and we'll talk a little bit about his book. Let's go ahead and spend some time now with Joe Hudson. Well, hey everyone, and today I am joined by my friend Joe Hudson, who is an accomplished figure and bust painter. Joe is a frequent contributor to Fine Scale Modeler and has recently written a book and published a book called Modeling Military Figures. He's kindly agreed to spend a little time here to talk about the book and the art of figure painting. Welcome to Interstellar Modeler, Joe.
Hey, Augie, how's it going? Thanks for
I,
having me.
I'm doing great. Yeah, I appreciate you being on. It's been a while since I've wanted you on the channel, so I'm so glad we got the chance to get together here. Well, before we dive into the book, let's just start by telling us a few things about yourself. First of all, what drew you to the art form, and how long have you been at it?
Well, as everybody, I started as a young kid building the Aurora models, and then got into sports and girls, and then I went through the military, but then slowly, after I got out of the military, I became a police officer, and I started getting back into the hobby, and it was, I want to say about 30, 35 years ago, could be a little bit longer. I was working at the Space Center in NASA in Florida, and I started building models with my good friend Rick Hill, and then I got I was in a real bad motorcycle accident, and then
Mm.
that's when I got in touch with Bob Letterman from VLS, and his wife Susan recommended me to go to the Atlanta Figure Show because I was really interested in doing figures, and I met Bob Nee, and he came to Florida, gave me some painting lessons, and after that, it's just basically been painting figures ever
Oh,
since.
okay, yeah. So I was going to ask you who who would you consider a mentor or anybody that you can name whose techniques you kind of influence you? I'm assuming that's one gentleman then that.
Yeah, he was the one who initially, but at the time he painted in all oils,
Mhm.
and eventually, I transitioned from oils to acrylics. But it was him, a guy named Mike Stetzel, and he was also kind of an oil painter, and then Bill Horan, he was actually an enamel painter, and it wasn't until the Spanish groups really started taking off with painting in acrylics in the figure world. So
Uh-huh.
slowly transitioned into painting from oils to acrylics.
Okay, great. Now, I know when I first got into figures or interested in them, and I remember it was Mark Fraley, I think, who introduced me to your work. I would just look at them and just think, wow, this guy is so good.
Oh man.
And I know as a beginner and anyone that looks at your work and first approaches it going, yeah, where do you even start? So I guess a question for you here is, what is your approach to a project? How do you arrive at the colors or the look that you want to achieve?
Um, it kind of varies, My background mainly was historical.
Hmm.
So when I was doing historical, it was trying to get what the figure looked like. For example, if you painted a German figure, this field gray is basically, but there's 20 different shades of field gray.
Hmm.
So it was just a matter of just trying to get the feel. Like, was it dirty? Was it clean? So if it was a pristine type of uniform, I maybe try to go with more of a brighter color, and
Hmm.
but with a field type uniform, I try to add some earth colors to the mix to just bring it to a more dirty, worn look.
Yeah.
And now with the newer stuff, I have a friend, Paul Kelly. He always asks me, he goes, "How do you do it?" And I'm like, basically, I'm just winging it. I kind of just I kind of see a color in my mind that I want it to look like, and I may have extra colors sitting on my wet palette, and I'm like, well, let's just start mixing colors. I mean, I'm not one to say, all the color theory and all that kind of stuff. It's basically just kind of a feel.
Yeah,
If you want a purple, you may want to mix a purple, or you might use a purple out of the bottle, or mix another color with it. So it's
sure.
kind of, kind of a feel how I approach it.
Yeah, so I guess that's advice I guess we can definitely give in general is to experiment a little bit, right? I mean, so it sounds like you just look at the subject, you kind of get a feel for what the colors could be, and just kind of start mixing and see what you come up with. I guess that
Yeah,
right?
you got to have fun with it, and
Mm-hmm.
not be afraid to make a mistake. And the one thing I do in my book and everything else is I try to keep all my mixtures simple. Like I've even told you, it's not 15 colors. There may be three at the most.
Yeah,
Just
right.
because that way, if you do find a color you like, it's not hard to um, do it again, replicate it, because I mess up all the time. So I'm
Mm-hmm.
always back and having to touch it up, and it might be 2 days later.
Now, one other question I have for you then is, what do you think about these paint sets? I know I've seen a number of them now come out from different companies that say specialize in colors they think would go with starships or sci-fi or horror or something like that. What are your thoughts about paint sets in general?
I have a drawer full of them.
Mm-hmm.
I recommend them because I mean, especially some people maybe they want to try a flesh set and they don't like say the flesh mixture that I start with. But I'm told you one time before, you can buy a flesh set and there may be a dark shadow color which might be a perfect color for a British commando beret. So
Mm-hmm.
there's all kind of colors you can find in it. And the other thing I would say too is if you get the flesh set or not flesh set, but paint sets. A lot of times they have it listed, like your base color or whatever. Sometimes they don't, but
Mm-hmm.
don't be afraid to throw like a dark purple, mixed in with a pink, or you don't have to go in order. You can make your own variations with the
Sure.
color.
Absolutely. Yeah. Again, experimenting as you go along a little bit there,
Yeah.
right? Yeah. So the book that Joe has written here again is called Modeling Military Figures. And I have found it to be a really nicely composed guide to figure painting that provides information about all kinds of techniques. So, first of all, what inspired you to write the book, and what was your goal?
Well, like we discussed earlier, it's 35, years when I
Yeah.
first started, and there was no internet, and there wasn't a lot of books out there. There were some books, but there wasn't a lot. And so when I first started, what originally, there were seam lines. I didn't really realize there were seam lines. And then, if you start seeing other people's work, it's like it looks better and better.
Yeah.
So what I wanted with my book was to give somebody who's never painted a figure
Mm-hmm.
the opportunity that they could buy a model or a plastic figure, know how to take it off the sprue, clean it up, make it presentable, so that way when you do paint it, you know, I mean, if you do a great paint job and you've got this seam line running right down the face,
Yeah.
it's gonna look terrible.
Yeah.
So this way it gives everybody kind of a step by step. And in the book, I've got it where it's basically a basic type with some advanced steps. That way you can start and then you can kind of increase, and try to add every color that I used in it. And every picture basically has a caption to it, and there's usually a pointer or a paintbrush showing. It's not like a lot of books that have big paragraphs and you know then the finished piece.
Right. Yeah. And I wanted to comment that I think then your goal is definitely achieved because I've read through the book and it does have a lot of illustrations, guys, with some really good concise descriptions. So I think we all know what he means when you buy a guidebook. Sometimes there's just a huge page of just writing, and it certainly can give you a lot of information. But this way, it's almost like he's sitting with you there side by side as he paints a figure. So really good job on that, Joe.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, this book reviews military figures, of course, but obviously these techniques are applicable to many other types of figures and busts, right?
Yeah, it's just the techniques. If you just change colors, like if instead of using a field gray, you could use purple. It's
Mm-hmm.
still using glazes and the paint dilutions and all that stuff.
Mm-hmm. Great. Now, you mentioned to me that you were interested in writing a second book, but one that would maybe center more on sci-fi. How would that book differ from this one?
Well, the next book, if I'm able to do it, is going to be more like the sci-fi comic book characters with brighter colors, and I also want to show how I paint my new style with painting, trying to paint more realistic.
Hmm.
So, instead of it being mainly a how to take it off a sprue, this could be a garage kit where it's cleaning up a resin figure or a 3D prints, how to clean up 3D prints, because I've seen some 3D painted pieces that look like masterpieces, but then when you look at the face, there's the print lines.
Yeah, the layer lines, right?
Yeah. And that just, when I look at it again, that's all I see is the layer lines.
Yeah, right, right.
you know, I would show how to make sure you get it, cleaned perfectly. You might miss a couple, but I mean, for the majority, it's going to be cleaning it and priming it and prepping it and just painting. Now, and now with I use a brush, but also to be how I use the airbrush.
Yeah, that sounds great. Yeah, because 3D printing, of course, is you and I have been working with it for a little while, but there's still a lot of people who are just kind of getting into it, and some of it can be a little intimidating, and you kind of
Right.
get your print. I remember when I first started, I was just happy that the thing even printed, but then you start looking closer and you're like, wow, what do I do with all these layer lines? And you have to kind of try to figure that out. So I'm glad that's something that you'll cover in the next book. That would be fantastic. Okay, well, I asked Joe if he wouldn't mind critiquing some of his work for us, and I thought it would be interesting to start with a very early figure, and then something he did later, and then something that he did most recently. So let's take a look at these. Joe was kind enough to send this one picture now of a figure from Beowulf. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. So as you look at this figure now, what comes to mind? What areas do you see that needed a lot of growth or improvement, and so forth?
On this one, pretty much everything, but this was this was one of my first early pieces. It's
Hmm.
a 70 millimeter Keith Durham sculpture of Beowulf, and with this one is when like I had mentioned, I was when I first learned how to paint in oils,
Hmm.
and what we did when we painted in oils, we painted it, we primered it, then we painted in acrylic. Some people used enamels, but usually it was an acrylic paint,
Hmm.
and then we put the oils over it. But because you know how you paint with oils before,
Yes.
it takes so long for them to dry. Bob
Yeah.
had taught me how to use a product called Dorland's wax.
Hmm.
So we would paint, say like the paint the blue, and then you would put a layer of this wax over the top of it, smooth it out, and then add highlights and shadows, and the wax would eventually absorb the oil
Oh, that's interesting.
or whatever the carrier,
Yeah.
and then it would become flatter. I do have to say one thing, that because at the time I was living in Florida, and I took this, not this piece, but I took a piece that was taking it to a model club meeting
Hmm.
during the day, and I left it in the car for a little bit because I ran into the store before I went there.
Uh
When I came back, because wax in Florida heat, it melted,
oh.
so
Yeah.
it wasn't a pretty sight.
Wasn't
But
a pretty sight.
with this, because the chainmail is really flat, there's no highlights per se, or shadows, and then all the other colors, they look like they have the same highlight and same shadow tones instead
Hmm.
of, or it doesn't have that pop.
Hmm.
And the other thing is the flesh is pretty much one tone. You can see as shadows, but it's pretty boring.
Well, still looks good to me, but but one question that does come to mind though is that with smaller figures now, the contrast between highlights, excuse me, and shadows probably have to be a bit more,
A little starker.
yeah, a little starker then, right?
Yeah. Usually I find the smaller the subject, the brighter I put the highlights in,
Hmm.
darker the shadows, because if you're looking at it, usually you're looking at it from about 12 inches away
Hmm.
at the closest. And if you don't, it just kind of all kind of blends together, especially with me with my eyesight.
Yeah.
So, the bigger figures, you still put highlights and shadows, but maybe not as stark because the natural light will give it a little bit. But the smaller one, you really need to put some more in, like, for example, on this cape, where it bunches right there at the tie,
Hmm.
I I could have went really dark,
Yeah.
you know, because you can't really see the separation there.
Yeah.
You could have went really dark in the fold, and then on the top edge, you could have went really bright, and it would have made that just stand out.
Stand out more. Yeah. Very good. Well, let's go ahead and move on to this second figure now, and this is a tank. What'd you call him now?
He's a U.S. tanker.
Used tanker. Okay. So let's take a look at this figure. Now, this was done much later, right? This was done not too long ago, I
For the
guess.
book. Yeah,
Uh-huh.
this is for the book.
Okay, good. And
And
so let's look at this one now and give us a little critique about this figure.
well, in the last figure we just looked at, he was 70 millimeters,
Hmm.
and this one is a much smaller figure. This is a 1/35th scale. I'm not exactly sure. I know 54 millimeters is 1/32nd scale. So
Hmm.
you can see it's, maybe half the size of the other one.
Hmm.
But this one has so much more pop because the darker shadows around, like at the top of the bib, you
Hmm.
can see how dark it is. And then there's a bright highlight, and the flesh has more life to it. There's higher highlights and, deeper creases.
Sure.
And in between the fingers and the clothing, you can see like on the pocket, there's edging and there's deep shadows. There's a whole lot more contrast,
Yes.
and, and it makes it look. This figure looks more alive than the other one.
Than the other one did. Yeah, and I
And,
love the shadowing along the face, even that 5 o'clock shadow look along his cheek and chin there. Yeah.
right, and I mean even the smaller details. If you look, this is actually just a cheap plastic Tamiya figure.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Hmm.
So I mean, you can look on his hand. There's a wedding band,
Oh, yeah.
and I mean it's highlighted and shadowed across there.
Hmm. Hmm.
So I mean, and like you were saying with the 5 o'clock shadow, you can go a little darker under here and bring it up, and it just gives it the fullness of the face.
Yeah, it's interesting as I'm looking at this figure, I look at some of this work like I would an oil painting hanging in a museum. Paintings, pictures, good photographs always tell a story. And when you
Right.
see all these details, there's a story behind him.
Yeah, and that also is a good point,
Hmm.
bringing it back, like how you approach something. Like when you look at a figure to paint it, you kind of want, what is he thinking at the time whenever you go to paint it?
Yeah,
Kind of put yourself in him.
yeah,
You know, what's going on, and then paint it accordingly.
yeah. And that type of approach definitely shows through in your work. Absolutely. Yeah, fantastic. Good.
Thing.
Well, let's go ahead and move on to this other one now. Then this is a most recent figure that you've done, and kind of describe the figure. And this also is an example of some of a change in your techniques now. Is that right?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
This this is the penguin, and with him, it was more of the new style that I do is with the airbrushes. But the last couple of figures were all painted with a paintbrush,
Hmm.
and I like to use the Zim paintbrushes as we've talked before.
Yes.
Because a lot of people too getting the paintbrushes is you don't have to have the smallest point. You want a brush that's going to hold paint so that you can then paint.
Hmm. Yeah.
But with the penguin here, I went with a different style too. Like, I knew I wanted to use purples and black, but you didn't want just pure black, you know. But because I was going to go with a purplish tone, I started his flesh completely different. I started it with a lilac color.
Hmm.
So it's kind of a light purple. And then I gradually built highlights and shadows over it, but it gave it kind of a cool tone.
Hmm.
And with him, this was done a lot with airbrush. You, like the highlights on the bow tie, or like on the gloves and on the shirt and the vest and the hat band, and some small details on the face were all brushed, but pretty much everything else was airbrushed.
Yeah.
And, like for the coat, because it's black, and we've discussed before, you never want to paint anything black because you can't go down in value with black.
That's right.
And with white, you never want to paint anything white because you can't go down. I mean, you can't go up in value with the white.
Yeah, right, absolutely. Yeah,
So
and
with
that's a very important point I wanted to make here is that that's one thing that Joe taught me early on, because him and I spent a little time during the pandemic when we were trying to find stuff to do. And I remember seeing his work. I wanted to see if he wouldn't mind spending a little time with me to teach me some of his techniques. And so I sent him out a little bust of the $6 Million Man we kind of worked on together. And these are little points that he taught me from the beginning. Is when you're talking about these super dark colors, you can't go darker than black. So you
right.
you have to kind of think of other ways or other paint colors you're going to use for these types of colors.
Yeah, and then saying that too is like his coat,
Hmm.
because you can't go black. But so what I did is I used three different shades of black.
Hmm.
I started with ivory black, and that was my base coat, which, like I just said, you can't paint with black, but which I did.
Yeah.
But the reason I painted it black was because that was my shadow color. That was going to be the shadow. So then I was able to go up in value. I left the, I didn't go down, try to put the shadows in. I just started with the whole thing being the shadow color.
I see. Wow. Very
And then
good.
I added different shades of, I used, so lately I've been using a lot of Monument Hobbies acrylics,
hmm
pro acrylic, and they really airbrush great. And so I use an ivory black gouache. I'd
hmm
never used gouache before, so somebody had told me about it, and so I used that as my base, and then I started adding Monument Hobbies coal black and blue black
hmm
in various mixtures and brought it up to the highlights. And then with black you don't want to go too much because it'll look striky, or I always call it the Nike effect. You have these swooshes all over the place.
Sure.
But this way, if you look, you can see it. It looks black, but it has the highlights and shadows.
Yeah.
And and then for the same thing, you don't want to paint the same color of hat as his coat. So the hat was painted with an ivory black with some coal black mixed to it. And then for the highlights, I used transparent burnt umber,
Oh.
give it a warmer look. The
hmm
coat is a cooler look, and the coat is the coat is a cooler look, and the hat is a warmer.
Yeah. Beautifully done. And Joe, this figure now is available also for purchase. Is that right?
Yeah, Rise 3D printing.
hmm
They have this one and a lot of new ones that we've done. We've done the Lone Ranger, Gamora,
hmm
and we've got a couple of different ones coming. But this one is, and it's a great. We were talking about prints. This is a
Sure.
great print,
Yeah.
you and the cigarette holder and everything. It all comes with it. With the smoke
Nice. Yeah. Yeah, so
and the
guys, I'll definitely put the link down to this figure below, and you'll see they are fantastic figures and busts that are available there. Yeah, absolutely. So, Joe, what's in store for Joe Hudson now? What would you like to work on from here?
I've got a lot of projects that I'd like to do.
Yeah.
Um, as you know, we're getting a lot of stuff designed. So, kind of a lot of childhood memories that really inspire me,
hmm
so that's some of the new stuff that I want to do. But I want to get better at painting realistic. I'm getting better than I was a whole lot better than I was, but there's still little parts that really annoy me. I can't quite get it, so that's
Yeah.
something I really want to keep working on. And then the other thing is, before I used to worry so much about going to competitions. We've talked before. You
Sure.
paint to go to a competition. For years that's what all I did was I was painting and going to competition, where you don't end up having any fun because you're so worried about, is this good enough? This
Right.
so nowadays I don't care. I'm
Yeah.
just painting stuff that I've always wanted to paint because your life's too short to just keep worrying about. So you got to paint what you want to paint
hmm
and enjoy it, and that's what I've had to teach myself.
Yeah, absolutely. As is anything in life, if your passion shows through your work, people definitely can see that. Yeah, absolutely.
Right, yeah.
Yeah. Well, is there any advice you'd like to give the model community?
Always, as you're I won't say the professional word, but an eye doctor,
Yeah.
um, definitely make sure you can see what you're painting.
Yeah.
Where I use an optivisor. If you
hmm
can't see, get by an optivisor, or glasses that you can see what you're doing, because there's nothing worse than struggling. And the other one thing we had mentioned one time before is I always take pictures of my work. You
Mm.
know, if you take pictures of your work and then go look at it and look at it critically, you can see where you messed up. I mean, I have had pieces that were completely done. I take it and show my wife, and she's like, "What's wrong with that eye?" I'm like, "What do you mean?
Yeah.
That eye, right?"
Yeah.
And it looks fine. And she said, "No, it's not." So then I take a look at it, and the picture's like, "Holy cow, that eye is all wonky."
Yeah. Give you a different perspective.
Yeah, so that way you can see it front, and then you can also blow it up. Like when we're painting, like these figures now are bigger, but before when I was painting little figures, you really can't see. But
hmm
when you can blow it up this big, you can
Yeah.
see where like
Yeah.
I did a little gaming Yoda,
hmm
and smaller than a quarter, but there's pupils in your or eyeballs,
Right.
and any other time you wouldn't be able to see that, but by blowing it up, you can see what you need to do.
Yeah.
I would say definitely make sure you can see what you're doing, take pictures, use good paintbrushes.
Hmm.
You got to have good paintbrushes because I prefer the natural brushes. Synthetics don't hold points for me, and some people may get beautiful masterpieces, but when you're painting detail work, you want that you want that bristle to be kind of fat that goes to a nice point so it holds paint so you can get longer lines and longer brush strokes and all
Hmm.
without leaving streaks. So good paintbrushes, and like I said, I prefer Zembrushes. That's who I've used, and he's got some really great sables
Yeah, he really does. And I'll post the link, guys, below to Zembrush because Joe introduced me to that company, and they really do make some good products.
at a good price too.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then the other thing is good paints, but I'm going to say this: good paints, but learn how to master the paint that you're using, because on these larger scale figures, I'm actually now using, instead of these $3 or $4 bottles of paint, sometimes I'm using a 98-cent bottle of paint from Hobby Lobby, just
Yeah.
depending on what color I need at the time.
Right. Yeah.
But you have to have a good paint consistency, and it has to be thin good enough to use.
Yeah.
But you just got to find a brand that you really like. But the good thing too with the acrylics, you can mix different brands,
Hmm.
which really helps.
Yeah. Yeah.
I may be using Pro Acryl, but I might have a good AK that I like that I can mix together.
Sure.
So,
Yeah.
so, so paintbrushes, be able to see it, take pictures, be critical, and enjoy.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah, very good advice. And there's again much more good advice in Joe's book and can call modeling military figures. I'm fortunate enough to have had Joe autograph mine, so appreciate that. And Joe, it's available at Amazon and a couple other places. Is that right?
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Amazon and my hobby shop carries them, and the ones at my hobby shop, I sign when they get them in. I sign them, and if you want it personalized, I'm willing to go up there and sign it
Yeah.
for you.
Fantastic.
So
Well, congratulations on that book. And again, guys, I really do recommend it. It's a great way to get into painting figures. On a personal level, I never really thought about painting figures a whole lot. I remember talking about going to a model show. I built this eagle, from Space 1999, did everything I could on the exterior, thought it was looking great. And there was this one model show they used to do in San Diego where they actually would provide critiques of your model. And one of the things they said was, you could have done a little bit better for John's figures. And I'm thinking, who's gonna? And when I was putting this together, I was like, who's gonna see them? You see these little windows, that sort of thing. But you know what? They look very lifeless inside that command module.
right,
And it's just one of those things I never really thought much about. And I can say a lot of people, a lot of subscribers have kind of voiced that to me. They're like, oh, figure painting is just not my favorite thing. But again, when you have a guidebook like this and you got some great advice there, it really kind of gets you into it. And I don't know, that's what really got me into moving into even larger figures and had a lot of fun, again, with Joe learning from him. And as you've seen, I moved to the $600 man figure, which is
oh
bigger.
yeah,
Yeah, and
which was
hope.
a nice job.
Thank you, thank you, and hope definitely to do more stuff like that. So thank you, Joe, for sharing your time with us. I really do appreciate it. And
Thank
yeah, and have fun painting, and I look forward to seeing more of your work.
thank you, Augie.
All right, thanks. Take care. Well, I hope you enjoyed that interview. I know it went a bit longer than what I've typically done in the past, but we've got into some great conversation, so I decided to leave most of what we talked about in. As for the links we talked about through the interview, I am leaving them down below. And so certainly if you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them here on my YouTube channel or at innocentmodeler@gmail.com. Now, whether I do more of these, it kind of depends on whether I can coordinate schedules. It seems easier to do interviews at events like Wonderfest, but we'll see how it goes. As for my next project now, it's going to be the Star Wars Landspeeder. This is a Rebel kit that I purchased several years ago, and I finally got everything I need together for that build, so I'm going to get that started pretty soon, and I'll give you more details in an upcoming video. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you then. Take care.